I kicked off 2025 with this video here, 10 resolutions for Christianity, which by the way is one of my favorite videos, so if you missed it, please go and check it out after this one. But many Christians responded with, that's not how resolutions work, you don't get to make them for other people. I understand that. It was just a fun, unique way to critique some of the claims of Christianity. And many believers wrote back with some resolutions for myself, but there was one in particular who gave me 3 resolutions and the challenge, would you be willing to engage with these counter perspectives as thoroughly as you expect Christians to engage with yours? Fair enough. You get an entire video. Resolution number 1, examine your logical consistency. You criticize Christianity for past human actions like the Crusades, yet you wouldn't accept someone dismissing science based off unethical scientists like Mengele. In 2025, perhaps consider applying the same standards of logical evaluation to both religious and secular topics. Are you critiquing actual Christian teachings or human misuse of religion? When I brought up the Crusades, it was in reference to my first point, which is that Christianity would go a long way by owning up to past mistakes. Also, we are told how to judge Christianity by its fruit. If the fruit is horrendously poisonous and it happens en masse, I think it is indeed worth pointing out. And also, it's not like the Crusades were done by a renegade group of individuals. This isn't just a misuse of religion, nor were the other examples that I gave, but we'll stick with the one you brought up, the Crusades. These historical events stemmed directly from Christian teaching and instruction and interpretation of the Bible, explicitly sanctioned by even the Pope himself via religious and biblical justification. So we could talk all day about why the Crusades were bad, why that reflects poorly on Christianity, and why that does give us a license to question the teachings within Christianity if they can lead to these things not just once but many times, and in many different fashions. What we see happening with Christian nationalism is just the newest one. But that was only half your point, because your next sentence is you wouldn't accept someone dismissing science because of unethical scientists like Mengele. So Josef Mengele, if you didn't know, was in the Nazi Party, also referred to as the Angel of Death, who conducted horrific and fatal experiments on the prisoners in Auschwitz. And maybe I'm not understanding your point very well here, because I would argue that there's not a scientist alive today that would not criticize Mengele. Yet we have many Christians that still make excuses for all of the things that I talked about. Also, science is not a religion. It doesn't have prescriptions. Christianity is and does. Science is a methodology. It's a tool for understanding the natural world. The actions of Mengele didn't stem from scientific teaching or instruction. Science is a tool, and tools can be abused or used well. Now, if you want to agree with me that religion is also a tool and can be used well or abused, then let's have that conversation. But that's not the claim of Christianity. The claim of Christianity is that it is perfect truth, that it is the only correct religion, that when one gives their life to Christ, they are born again, made anew, that they have the power of the Holy Spirit working in them. That's why I can do an internal critique on Christianity and show those issues. And that is why it is not comparable with an individual scientist misusing the tool of science. By the way, Mengele, he was a Catholic. Well, your answer might be that he wasn't a practicing Catholic and that this had nothing to do with his Catholicism, to which I would say, okay, same thing with science. But unlike that, the Crusades were done in the name of Christ, in the name of religion, in the name of Christianity. This is just simply not an apples to apples comparison. And I think it's so important to be able to have this conversation. So I thank you for bringing it up, because so many believers will do this finger pointing back at science. These things are not alike. And so no, you cannot and should not critique them in the same way. Should anyone call out poor and harmful behavior regardless of where it comes from? Yes, and that's what's so cool about science. Science is constantly trying to correct itself. Science is constantly trying to prove itself wrong. Science, by way of progress, has to admit when it messes up. Science is setting the example for what I said in my first resolution, that Christianity needs to own up to past mistakes. Doctors used to kill tons of mothers and babies simply because they did not wash their hands before surgery, before we had the understanding of germ theory. Now, science says that was wrong. Here's what we know now, and this is the best way to move forward until we find a better way. If Christianity actually did this, this religion would look very, very different than it does today. The last thing I'll say about it is that one must examine the claims of these organizations, for lack of a better term. Christianity claims to provide a moral framework. When that framework leads to harm, it warrants critique. Science claims to try to explain the natural world. When individuals misuse scientific discoveries or practices, it's not a failure of science, but of that individual's ethics or governance. And again, I just can't get over the hilarious part that this person is not some atheist mad scientist. They were a Catholic. When Christianity can start evolving itself like science does through new information, correcting understanding, instead of just following some religious dogma that often resist that same kind of scrutiny, then we can be on a better same footing to have the kind of conversation you're wanting to have. Let's move on to your second one here. Resolution number 2, challenge your assumptions about divine evidence. You demand scientific proofs in a spiritual text, expecting God to conform to your predetermined criteria of what constitutes divine authorship. For 2025, consider if the expectation is reasonable. If the Bible had contained explicit modern scientific knowledge, wouldn't skeptics then claim it was edited? Why assume God must prove himself according to your specific expectations? So, the first thing to say is this came from my second resolution, which was to provide clear evidence of a divine author. Because Christianity claims that. Again, it comes back to the claims of Christianity, but there's no evidence for that in the Bible. If you just want to have a religious book that doesn't claim to come from a perfect, omniscient, omnipotent God, then I won't expect to see those things in the book. But if I'm told I should believe in this God and that if I don't, he will burn me alive forever, then when I go to read the book, the source material to gain that faith, to have the evidence for that belief, which by the way, is what is written in the Bible. In John, the clearest gospel on salvation, he says, I write these things so that you may know and by knowing that you may believe. So again, the Bible puts forward this goal, but when I read the Bible and I see the issues and the contradictions and the incorrect science and the incorrect history, it does not allow me to believe that this comes from a divine source. So my point about if this is going to be claimed from a divine source, it should look like that isn't even necessarily demanding scientific proof. I gave an example of something that could have been done, like Jesus referencing understandings that would be found out later, so something that couldn't have been known at that time. I referenced the Bible not getting things incorrect, like the order of creation. That's not demanding that the Bible has some kind of scientific standard. It's just saying if you're going to put forward a claim, that claim should be true. Because via our scientific understanding, we know certain things now that the writers of the Bible back then simply couldn't, and no fault on them. But you don't want me to believe it was just written by men. You want me to believe it was inspired. You want me to believe that when God is bragging in Job, which is an example I gave, that what he's bragging about is going to be correct, except we know that it's not. So going back and saying the Bible should have been accurate with its information is not me saying, oh, actually the Bible should have all of these scientific proofs within it. I think there's some nuance there that you're missing. Imagine this reversed in any other situation. If I tell you I'm the world's richest man, actually right now having a studio on Mars because I'm so far advanced, but I give some details like how I don't wear an oxygen mask, that's going to cause you to doubt my claim. And if you say, hey, if you had wanted me to believe that, you probably should have had the understanding that it would have been required to have some kind of system for breathing when living on that planet because of scientifically what we know about the conditions of that planet. And I said back to you, whoa, why are you trying to bring science into my claim? It's a spiritual claim. Some claims in the Bible are spiritual claims, but not all of them are. And so when we have claims in the Bible that are incorrect, it brings into question those other spiritual claims. And if the Bible is supposed to be the source, again, for how we understand the divine, then one of the things that would help is to have evidence for that divine authorship. And again, I would be fine if the Bible simply didn't state things. If it was just aphorisms about morality and it was just teachings on philosophical ethics, then we can evaluate those off of their own value. We can disagree and we can do all of these things, but it goes further, doesn't it? It makes truth claims. And when they fail, it's fair to point out that it would have been better if I'm supposed to believe in it to not have those truth claims be falsified. I don't think it's so much to ask for the God of the universe to get things right, which is essentially all that point was. And also, before we close out on this point, your other point here of if the Bible had contained explicit modern scientific knowledge, wouldn't skeptics then claim that it was edited? No. We would be impressed with the knowledge, because a God who could do that would also have a way of preserving the dating correctly, which actually we're able to do from a scientific understanding. We have many different ways of dating the writings of the Bible. It's a fascinating field of study. We know for a fact within a given time frame, not precisely, when many, not all, of the documents that contain parts of the Bible were indeed authored. There might be oral tradition that comes before that, but we can say verifiably we had these documents, the original manuscripts, before X date. So if people in the 6th century BCE claiming to speak for God had actually gotten these things so perfectly correct that we wouldn't be able to discover and verify via the scientific method for well over 1,000 years later, no, we wouldn't just throw our hands up and say, it's a lie. It would be evidence that we would have to contend with. What a cop-out answer that is. God didn't bother being accurate because you wouldn't have accepted it anyways is not a good argument. But let's move on to number 3. Reconsider your perfect clarity demand. Your call for Christianity to get its story straight assumes that different perspectives equal contradiction and complexity equals falsehood. For 2025, consider that varying gospel accounts, like different witness testimonies in court, might actually strengthen credibility rather than weaken it. Why assume an all-wise God would prioritize simplicity over depth? There are a lot of things in there that are simply incorrect. I never assumed that an all-wise God should prioritize simplicity over depth. I assumed an all-wise God should prioritize truth over falsehood. There is a huge difference. You don't just get to call what is clearly mutually exclusive information in these texts complexity. That's a cop-out. Deal further than that. I have given, through the last 300 videos on this channel, example after example after example after example of where these texts do not align. Not just from different perspectives. I've also been incredibly fair to point out that different perspectives do not equal untruth. In fact, I did so just recently in my Christmas video. And just so you know I'm not being petty, another difference is the perspective that is taken. Matthew focuses on Joseph's perspective and Luke focuses on Mary's perspective. And that's kind of cool. And that would be fine. That's an example of two people writing the same story, but with slightly different views, and then you're going to get different details. The problem is when those later details completely don't work together. But going back to that same Christmas video about the Nativity, we had some irreconcilable contradictions, or even comparing the gospel accounts to the historical accounts. Like one gospel account saying that they had to travel for a census, which is just a plot device to get them where they needed to be to fulfill supposed prophecy from the Old Testament that had nothing to do with that, when historically we know that a census like that was not taken. That's not complexity. It's falsehood. I never made the claim, as you have said that I have here, that different perspectives equal contradiction. I made the claim that contradictions equal contradiction. Here's another simple one for you just to show that it's not a matter of complexity. On this side of the screen, you can see verses where the Bible claims that no one can see the face of God. And on this side of the screen, you can see verses where people saw the face of God. That's a contradiction. Just because it's a mysterious God figure doesn't equal complexity. Just like if I told you, no one can see my face, and then you are here seeing my face, those two things just don't work together. And by the way, I gave my Christmas video example to kind of respond to what you're claiming about gospel differences, but in my point 3, when I brought up getting your story straight, it was about more than just little silly contradictions or biblical errors. It was about how we understand salvation or baptism. In one spot in the Bible, it says baptism is for the forgiveness of sins. Some Christians still believe that. Others see baptism as a symbolic act of rebirth, and many Christians believe that. Those are two mutually exclusive claims about baptism. Both can be found in the Bible, and both can be represented in Christianity today. Thus, get your story straight. No complexity needed. It was about if salvation can be lost. Verses that say it can't, verses that say it can. Christians that believe it can't, Christians that believe it can. Get your story straight. Verses that allude that salvation is works-based versus verses that allude that it is faith-based only. Christians that believe one thing and Christians that believe another. Get your story straight. See, it's not even just me pointing out verses that then Christians and apologists have to come up with excuses for. It's showing itself in real time through different Christian beliefs, both claiming they have the witness of the Holy Spirit and the same exact Bible. Get your story straight. And I'm sad that you only did 3 because it probably means you only watched the first 3. I would have loved to do this with 7 more. I didn't just throw these up willy-nilly. I thought through these and I have good evidence for them. And I had only one question at the end of that video, which was, even if you're a Christian, could you agree that it would be better if we had these things, these 10 resolutions, if they were real about Christianity? So I've answered your questions, but you did not answer mine. You had to finger point back and say, I know I am, but what are you, about my first point. Wouldn't it have been better if Christianity could just own up to past mistakes instead of you having to come up with different ways to justify the fact that they haven't by pointing fingers at us like it's somehow equal? Wouldn't it have been better if you had clear evidence you could point to in the Bible to prove divine authorship? Which, by the way, if you did, you would use. And the Christians who think there is, use it in their proselytizing, in their evangelizing. In that video, we also talked briefly about the case for Christ. The case for Christ. The evidence for it based off the Bible. Because when Christians believe they have it, they use it. But when someone like me points out that it's not sufficient, you say, he doesn't owe you that. Well, which is it? If tomorrow there was a scientific discovery that somehow completely aligned biblically, I don't know a single Christian church or YouTube channel that would not be promoting that. So let's drop the facade of, that's not what the purpose of the Bible is for. You shouldn't expect that. You don't need it. Christians could care less. It's about faith. It's a spiritual text, yada, yada, yada. No. It makes claims. It makes truth claims. They just don't add up, so you have to do this backtracking. And your third one is simply to deny the reality, to try to gaslight me into believing that anytime I see mutually exclusive information in your collected canon, it must be because the God who divinely inspired it, via all of his mystery and higher thoughts and ways, is too complex for my understanding, instead of the much more obvious and simple and straightforward answer, that it looks just like all other man-made religions, that there's plot holes, that it's not congruent, that there's contradictions, and that yes, it would have been better to get the story straight. So that was a pretty long video to answer 3 questions, but I wanted to be as thorough as I expect the Christians who watch my video to be, just like you asked me to. That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know your thoughts on this. If you have any other resolutions for me that you'd like me to respond to, maybe we can do that again in the future. I'll see you Thursday with a new video, and until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast, Ann, Boris, GVI, Joe, Kitboga, Perry, Rokkit, Shawn, and Tom, my Humanist heroes, James, Jarrod, Kristi, and Thronus, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, David, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Lisa, Paul, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people. Thanks, and have a great day.